So I've learned that one of my favorite things about being a parent is getting to see the old and the familiar through the eyes of my daughter. Like, nobody told me that when you become a parent, you basically get this ready-made excuse to just go back and watch all of your old favorite cartoons and Disney movies all over again and not feel guilty about it. Like, she thinks that I'm putting on Aladdin or Toy Story for her, but who are we kidding? It's for both of us, right? She's about to turn 2 years old, and so we're just in such an exciting phase of life right now where she's discovering so many things for the first time, and she's beginning to appreciate things in brand new ways. Like right now, she loves colors. I've never really cared that much about colors. I care about it to the degree that my clothes match, and that's really all that matters to me, but she loves colors right now. And we have some of those Hue light bulbs in our house. There's like 10,000 colors. And it is nothing for us to spend 20 or 30 minutes a day saying, "Hey, Google, make all the lights blue." Blue. "Hey, Google, make the lights red." Red. She can't get enough of it. It is so much fun to watch. And I have realized what a gift it is to be around her and to get to see the familiar through new and fresh eyes. And, in a lot of ways, that's really what this series, Sticks and Stone, has been about, as we have taken a look at the cross. Because, the cross is the most universally recognized religious symbol in the history of the world. It's in our art, in our architecture, it's in media all over the place, especially at this time of year. We put it in our homes, on tattoos, on jewelry, on bumper stickers. The cross is everywhere. And for good reason, of course. But I don't know about you, but I can speak for me. I have been in church long enough, and I have been around enough Easters to know that if I'm not careful, the cross can become a little bit too familiar to me. And so we've done this series because we wanted to slow down and prepare our hearts and our minds this Easter to see the cross like never before. So in week 1, we talked about how the cross is the counterintuitive way that God wins a victory over sin, over death, over his enemies, and he gives new life to his people. In week 2, Pastor Paul talked about the cross as the culmination of Israel's story, how so many of the events in the Hebrew Bible are just signposts. They're like shadows pointing in advance to something, or rather someone much more full, much better. Things like Passover, things like the Day of Atonement. And so today, as we kind of round things out, as we're 1 week out from Easter Sunday, we're going to talk about the cross again, and we're going to get one more vantage point of the amazing story of the cross. And today, our goal is to talk about how the cross continues to shape and to reshape our story as those who practice the way of Jesus together. And so we are going to start with, I think it would be appropriate on Palm Sunday, the story of the triumphal entry of Jesus. If you don't have much of a church background, that's the name of the story that we call the moment when Jesus arrives to the city of Jerusalem in the final week of his life to take Passover with all of his followers. And just by way of context, you may not be able to see this map in great detail, but the point is, Jesus has spent most of his life and most of his ministry in kind of the north of Israel, the region of Galilee. But in the final movements of the gospel narratives, Jesus begins to make his way south, kind of we think along something like this red line, and he's making his way towards the city of Jerusalem. And all along the way, he's not only got his 12 followers and some of his closest friends, but every time he stops and tells an amazing story or performs miracles or casts out demons, he's picking up this massive crowd of people, and they are all following him along the way as he makes his way to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry. Now, all 4 of Jesus' biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell us about this story. But we're going to primarily spend our time in Luke, and we'll pick up pieces from the others. But we're going to begin in Luke chapter 19. If you want to go ahead and pull that up, I'll have some of the slides here on the screen. And we'll begin with this. With these words, Luke says, Jesus went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. Now, we actually have to pause right there with this first verse, because with these words, what words is Luke talking about? Well, he's pretty clearly talking about the preceding story because Jesus has just told a parable. It's actually one of his most famous stories. If you've been in church for any length of time, you've probably heard a good sermon or two on this. Jesus said that there was a man of noble birth who decided that it was time to go away because he was going to receive a kingdom. He was going to receive his royal authority. And so before he leaves, he calls all of his servants together. And he says, hey, I'm going away for a period of time, but I'll be back. And while I'm gone, here's silver. I want you to do business on my behalf until I return. And so the man of noble birth leaves, but eventually, like he said, he comes back with royal authority at his hands. And he calls his servants together because he wants to know, what have you done with what I gave you? What did you do with my resources? Now, in Luke's telling, some of the servants, they immediately decide they don't want this man to become king. And so they send a delegation to oppose him. And so when the king returns, he treats them as traitors. It doesn't go well for them at all. But then there's another group of servants, and they come to the king, and they say, look, we did a great job. You gave us this silver, and we doubled our investment, and we are so proud to show you what we did. And the king is so happy with them. And then, of course, there's this other guy that we know from the story. He's given one piece of silver, and he comes to the king, and he says, I put it in a handkerchief, and I hid it. I didn't really do anything with it. And it doesn't go well for him either. And we don't have anything like the time to unpack that story today. I just tell it to you because it's interesting. Luke actually tells us why Jesus told this parable at this moment. Luke chapter 19, verse 11. While the people were listening to this moment being the time when he's just had this amazing conversation with Zacchaeus, the tax collector, and all these people are listening to the scene and watching it. And while they're listening, Jesus went on to tell them a parable, this parable. They were, after all, getting close to Jerusalem, and they thought, all of these people who were following Jesus, they thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. This is so important to understand. All of these disciples, these followers, these onlookers, these curious people who are making their way to Jerusalem with Jesus, they're doing so because they believe that he is the Messiah, God's anointed one, the true and final king of Israel. And they think that when he gets to Jerusalem, the kingdom of God is going to arrive in all of its fullness. And for most of them, of course, that means that the king will establish his throne, that he will rally an army, and he will defeat the Romans. And by doing so, he will usher in this time of peace and prosperity like Israel has not known for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so Jesus tells them a parable to reset their expectations. And with these words, he makes his way up to Jerusalem. We'll continue on in Luke 19. It's too many verses for the TV, so I'll just read it over you. If you want to follow along, you can. Verse 29, as they came close, as near as Bethany and Bethphage, at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples on ahead. Go into the village over there, he said, and as you arrive, you'll find a colt tied up, one that nobody has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone says to you, why are you untying it? You should say, because the master needs it. I love that, by the way. It's like, why are you taking my donkey? Well, my boss needs it. It's like, well, can your boss pay for it? I mean, do you have any money with you? The two of them were sent off, though, and they found it just as Jesus said to them. They untied the colt, and its owner said to them, why are you untying the colt? Because the master needs it, they replied. And apparently this works. Unbelievably, this works. They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and mounted Jesus on it. As he was going along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. When he came to the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began to celebrate and praise God at the top of their voices for all the powerful deeds that they had seen. Welcome, welcome, welcome with a blessing, they sang. Welcome to the King in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory on high. Some of the Pharisees from the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, tell your disciples to stop that. Let me tell you, replied Jesus, if they stayed silent, the stones would be shouting out. So let's pause there and just get a sense of this moment. Jesus and this large crowd of people, they have been making their way to Jerusalem for a while, and they are fired up. This is the moment. The king is arriving. The kingdom is coming. And what does Jesus do next? He sends for a donkey. Now, here's a question worth asking. Why did a man who spent his whole life and ministry walking around on foot, who nowhere else in the Gospels are we told that he ever rides an animal of any kind, why does he make this long, long journey from Galilee down to Jerusalem on foot, get a mile or two from the city, and then stop and send for transportation? Well, actually, we're helped here by Matthew's gospel and his account of these events, because in his telling, he points us back to the Old Testament, back to one of the prophets named Zechariah in chapter 9, verse 9, and it says this: "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." This is so brilliant by Jesus. You see, Israel is controlled by the Roman Empire. You don't just roll up on the most important city in the nation of Israel and say, "I'm the king. I'm here to take my kingdom." It doesn't go well when you do that for the Romans. And so if you're Jesus, what you do instead is you ride a donkey. And by doing so, you activate in the minds and in the hearts of all of those people who are following you this event. These are people, these are Jewish men and women who have their minds saturated in the Hebrew Bible, anticipating these promises, knowing these stories, and they know exactly what this means. But the Romans have no clue. See, in their minds, kings don't ride donkeys. Peasants are not armies, and this scene is no problem at all. This is so brilliant by Jesus. But it's actually quite subversive and provocative as well. R.T. France, New Testament scholar, writes this. He says, "There is a subtle tension within Zechariah's description of this messianic king. He is victorious and yet meek, and his triumph is received rather than won. He rides a donkey rather than a war horse, and as he approaches the city, it is a kingdom of peace rather than of coercion. When Jesus chose this oracle to enact as he approached the city, he was thus claiming to be the Messiah, but not the sort of Messiah much popular patriotism has hoped for." This is how we make sense of what Luke tells us next in verse 41. He says, "When he came near, being Jesus, and saw the city, he wept over it. 'If only you'd known,' he said, 'on this day, even you, what peace meant. But now it's hidden, and you can't see it. Yes, the days are coming upon you when your enemies will build up earthworks all around you and encircle you and squeeze you in from every direction. They will bring you crashing to the ground, you and your children within you. They won't leave one single stone on another.'" And I want to put this last phrase on the screen, because you didn't know the moment when God was visiting you. You didn't recognize the moment for what it really was. You see, here at the beginning of the week, tons of people who have been following Jesus are ready to welcome him into the city of Jerusalem as their long-awaited king. But by the end of the week, another group of people inside the city of Jerusalem, they will gather and they will shout something different. With one voice, they will cry out for him to be crucified as a criminal. And so Jesus weeps. He weeps because he knows they're looking for the wrong king, the wrong kind of king, the king who conquers his enemies. He weeps because he knows that they're looking for the wrong kingdom as well, the wrong kind of kingdom. A kingdom that comes through coercion, through power or violence or force. And Jesus knows that their desire for the wrong king and the wrong kingdom will set them on a path that will end in their destruction, because they will run up against the Romans. Some of you who may know history a little bit will remember that within 40 years of the moment when God visited his people, Within 40 years of the king riding into the city on a donkey, the city of Jerusalem is utterly destroyed. Israel, apparently tired of waiting for their king, tired of waiting for the kingdom, they force the Romans out of their city, and it begins a war that ends swiftly in 70 AD. And here's what Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us of this moment. He says, "Now as soon as the army, the Roman army, had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none to be the objects of their fury, Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple. It was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up from the foundation that there was left nothing to make those that came believe Jerusalem had ever been inhabited. This was the end which Jerusalem came to." They didn't recognize the moment of their visitation from God. Now, I know that's a lot, so let's come up for air for just a minute and summarize where we are. The king has arrived. Jesus is at the city of Jerusalem, and both he and the gospel writers intend for us to see this as the moment that the Messiah comes to receive his kingdom. But the kind of king he is and the kind of kingdom he came to bring are unlike anything that anybody expected, unlike anything that they had experienced before. Even Jesus' closest followers do not get this. In fact, if we rewind the tape just a little bit, in Mark's gospel, there's this really interesting story as Jesus and the crowds and everybody still making their way to the city of Jerusalem. Mark tells us that Jesus pulls his 12 aside and he says, "Listen, let me tell you what's about to happen. We're going to make our way to the city of Jerusalem, and the chief priests and the lawyers, they're finally going to have their moment. They've been looking for it and they're going to get it. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed. He's going to be condemned, and he's going to die. But in 3 days, he will rise again." It's like the first century equivalent of a spoiler alert. and the disciples are listening to this, but then Mark tells us in chapter 10, verse 35, that James and John, Zebedee's sons, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to grant us whatever we ask for." "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" asked Jesus. They continued, "Grant us," they said, "that when you're there, when you're in Jerusalem, in all your glory, one of us will sit at your right hand and the other will sit at your left." They don't get it. This isn't Jesus telling a parable. This isn't cryptic language. This isn't figurative speech. This is Jesus saying, this is precisely what is about to happen, and they still don't understand who they're following. They still think that he's the conqueror, and they're trying to make sure that they secure their spot in his kingdom. And so Jesus says, "Are you guys able to drink from the cup that I'll be drinking from? Are you able to receive the same baptism that I'm about to receive when we arrive?" And they look at each other and say, "Yeah, absolutely, we can handle it." "Okay," Jesus says, "you'll drink that cup and you will receive that baptism." But then he says this, it's so interesting. "But sitting at my right hand or at my left, that is not up to me. It's already been assigned." Like, what? Who got to you before we did, Jesus? How have you already assigned these positions of prominence in the glory of your new kingdom? Who has received such an assignment? And we don't learn the answer until a few chapters later in Mark chapter 15, 22 and following. They took Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means in translation, skull place. They gave him a mixture of wine and myrrh, but he didn't drink it. And so they crucified him. They parted his clothing between them, casting lots to see who would get what. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription giving the charge read, "The King of the Jews." And then Mark says this, so amazing. They also crucified 2 bandits alongside him, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus did indeed go to Jerusalem to become the king. He did indeed go to receive his kingdom. But the kind of king he was and the kind of kingdom he came to bring were not like anything that anybody ever expected, unlike anything ever experienced before. James and John, they thought they were going to Jerusalem in order to be exalted. Jesus knew that they were going so he could be executed. They thought that this moment was about a crown of gold and a throne. And Jesus knew better. This moment was about a crown of thorns and a cross. They thought that they were going to see the view from the top and watch everyone below them serve them. But Jesus came to show them a different way of life. The view from the bottom, the perspective of the servant. And the point is this: if you want to understand what kind of king Jesus is and the kind of kingdom he came to bring, you have to look at the cross. As we said from week 1, the cross was and the cross is a victory. But it's not the kind of victory that we would expect. It was not a victory over suffering, it was a victory through suffering. Jesus didn't win the victory by inflicting violence on his enemies. He won the victory by absorbing the violence of his enemies. It was not a victory won through conquering. It was a victory won through self-giving love. N.T. Wright sums it up so well. He says, the story of the cross is the story of love, covenant love, faithful love, reconciling love, messianic love. It is the story of the victory of that love because self-giving love turns out to have a power of a totally different sort from any other power known in the world. And so if that's what the cross is, and that's what the cross was, then the question that I want us to wrestle with in these last couple of minutes is this: what does it mean for people? What does it mean to be people who live in light of that kind of victory? In other words, what if the victory of the cross was not just the means of Jesus winning 2,000 years ago? What if it is the model of victory that we are supposed to follow in all of life? This seems to be precisely what the Apostle Paul has in mind in places like, for example, Philippians chapter 2, where he writes this in verse 3 and following: never act out of selfish ambition or vanity. Instead, regard everybody else as your superior. Look after each other's best interests, not your own. This is how you should think among yourselves, with the mind that you have because you belong to the Messiah, King Jesus, who, though in God's form, did not regard his equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself and received the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of humans. And then, having human appearance, he humbled himself and became obedient even to death. To death, Paul? Yes, even the death of the cross. And so God has greatly exalted him, and to him, in his favor, has given the name which is over all names, that now, at the name of Jesus, every knee within heaven shall bow, on earth too, and under the earth, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus, Messiah, is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I love how one author summarizes this passage. He says that when Jesus came in the form of a servant, he was not disguising who God is. He was revealing who God is. See, when Jesus says things like, I have come to serve, not to be served. When Jesus with his guys says, listen, I know how the Gentiles do it. They love to lord their authority over everybody for their own personal benefit. But we're going to do it the other way. When Jesus says on the last night of his life at Passover with his friends, a new command I give you, that you are to love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. And then he picks up a towel and he washes their feet. These are not things that Jesus does despite the fact that he is God. These are things he says and does because this is what God is like. And so, when Jesus says in Luke chapter 9, if any of you want to come after me, you must say no to yourselves and pick up your cross every day and follow me. When he says that, it's not a metaphor for something else. He means it. He means that the cross is supposed to shape and to reshape our story continually. He means that to follow a crucified king is not just to see ourselves as the beneficiaries of his cross, but to also see ourselves as agents and representatives of that cross, as people who are committed to learning the cruciform lifestyle, a lifestyle shaped by the cross. This is how the victory that Jesus won continues to make its way into our lives and into our world. This is how God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. And so we, who have been gripped by and transformed by the story of that cross, we are supposed to see ourselves as the in-between people. We stand in between the victory that Jesus won 2,000 years ago and the culmination of that victory at the end of all things. And our task as the church in this present moment is to implement the victory of the cross by modeling the way of the cross. And I know of no better way to do that than by embodying the self-giving love of the Messiah. As individuals, this means taking the posture of the servant. It means learning to see and to seize all of those little opportunities that come along throughout our day where we can humble ourselves and serve somebody. It is to ask, in the words of Dr. King, life's most urgent and persistent question: what am I doing for others? It is to look those around me in the eye and say, how can I help? It is to ask on behalf of another, how can I leverage my authority, my power, my benefits, my privileges for your sake? Expecting that the answer will almost certainly mean the reorientation of our priorities, our time, our resources, and our energies. It is to learn to die 1,000 little deaths every single day, knowing that when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to have to die all over again. Collectively, as the church, this means that we are to diligently seek out the enemy's territory, the places where the victory of the cross has yet to be seen or heard or felt or experienced, where forgiveness has never been granted, where freedom has never been tasted, where fullness has never been known. And to charge into those places with the good news of the crucified King and the fullness of his kingdom. It means that we must, at all costs, resist the urge to use the means of the world to accomplish the purposes of the cross. It means that we must, at all costs, resist the urge to abdicate our calling, our vocation, to the professionals, or the experts, to the specialists, or the politicians. In his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, Tom Holland, the historian, not the actor, writes this after looking at the sweeping history of the last 2,000 years in the Western world and how the cross of Jesus has fundamentally altered and shaped that story. He writes, "To be a Christian is to believe that God became a man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it. The audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization to which it gave birth." The sheer strangeness of Christianity. I love that. It is strange that one day a man rode a donkey into the city of Jerusalem, and then a few days later, situated between two criminals, he ascended his throne by way of a cross. But the king that nobody expected, and the kingdom, unlike anything ever experienced before, have been changing the world ever since. It is the way of the cross, the way of self-giving love. They are indeed strange, but it's the strangeness of them that we dare not lose for anything, not just for our sake, but for the sake of every single person out in our world who has yet to experience how life-giving, how transformational strange can be. That is what Easter, after all, is all about.